I know this isn't the usual intro, but very quickly, I'm just pasting this on to the beginning. I know sometimes, for whatever reason, these podcasts won't go up on YouTube or iTunes at the time they should. I don't know why it happens. Sometimes it just does, and I inevitably fix it, but not always straight away. So please remember, you can always go to SoundCloud, which is the first place the podcasts go up, or you can go to ptcgradio.wordpress.com, which is also one of the first results you'll have if you Google PTCG Radio. That has not only a complete archive of every podcast I've recorded, except for 2, which I don't know if I've misnumbered or lost. But you'll always find it on there, and it goes up on there right after it goes up on SoundCloud, literally like 5 minutes later. So if you're ever struggling for a podcast, you can download it on SoundCloud, and you can download it on WordPress, or you can listen. It's up to you. So if you're ever struggling to find it, that's a good place to look. Good morning, or depending when you're listening to this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name's Ross, and I was always told I had a voice for radio, so I've made a podcast all about the Pokémon trading card game. And you're listening to PTCG Radio. Now, this week it feels like kind of a bit of a quiet week, but the good news is, ladies and gentlemen, we have had a whole bunch of new X and Y 8. What is going to be our November set. Cards revealed in Japan. I really dig the way that they're releasing these cards week by week. We seem to have a few new every week to talk about. So when we finally get the set released, it's going to be me going through the highlights, reminding, giving updated impressions. Whereas here, I actually get to spend a bit more time on each card. This makes me probably happier than it should. I'm also going to go through some interesting listener questions. I don't do this as often as I should, but I got some cool little questions and comments and a couple of corrections, which I'm going to go through today. And I've been promising you for a little while now, I'm going to start taking a really in-depth look at the expanded format. So we're going to start that today. We're going to be looking at all the supporters, and I mean all the supporters, which come back in with expanded. We're not going to worry about X and Y on. You know that. That's the standard format. We've talked about them a lot more. But we're going to go through the extra supporters you'll have in expanded that you won't have in standard. So starting off then with some new cards. Actually, before we get some new cards, let's do a couple other fun little bits of news first. Starting off, the ECC has been announced for 2016. We all knew it was coming. We all knew it was going to be Arnhem in the Netherlands. As a side note, Holland is not a country. There are 2 principalities, I think that's the right word, regions essentially, in the Netherlands. And they together make up Holland. The Netherlands is the country as a whole. So if you go to Amsterdam, you are going to both Holland and the Netherlands. But then if you take the train to Arnhem for the ECC, you are no longer in Holland, but you are still in the Netherlands. Holland is a region, the Netherlands is the country. Bit teachery, I know, but there we go. It has been revealed it's going to be happening on the 20th and 21st of February next year, which, for those of you in the UK, is the weekend at the end of half term. This means I will definitely be going. And I know I've said that about Worlds and stuff in the past. I will be booking my flight this week. I'm just figuring out when people are going out. It means that rather than rushing out on the Friday after work, I get to leisurely make my way over there on the Thursday or Friday. I'll still have to rush back for work on the Monday, but that's okay. I get to go out, I get to go to the ECC, which makes sense because I went in 2012 and 2014, so I really should be making 2016. Any of my listeners in Europe, if you can, get to this. I know some of you go, I know some of you don't. I would heartily recommend the ECC. It is the biggest tournament in Europe all year. It is essentially the European Championships, although unofficially so. It is like a regional, but it's big. It's the only tournament in the whole of Europe this year that will have a top 32 cut, followed by a top 8 cut. No word yet, and there is a website for it. I will tweet that out if I remember, at the Wassy on Twitter. There's no word yet on whether it's going to be standard or expanded. Like most people, I am desperately hoping it's standard because I have a fun little deck idea for standard that won't work in expanded. So I am crossing my fingers that we will get a standard version of this. I really hope we do. So yeah, that's the ECC. If you're in Europe and you can go, it's February the 20th and 21st, which gives you plenty of opportunity to try and get it off work, book flights, etc. Also been announced this week, regionals. Regionals will be happening in the UK, and like I've said before, the way this works is that we are having 2 sets of regionals. This happens every year. The opening set is going to be standard, and they're all going to be standard. And then the second set, which will actually be next year, they will be in the expanded format. So, just very quickly, because I know not all of you listening are in the UK. In fact, the majority are from the US. That's where the majority of my listeners comes from. So, very quickly, in 2015, we have 6 in a row every weekend. 7th of November, Huddersfield. 14th, Sutton Coldfield. 21st, London. 28th, Wales. 5th, Stockton-on-Tees of December. And the 13th of December in West Sussex. I am likely to be going Huddersfield, Sutton, Wales and West Sussex. In 2016, we have the 5th of March in Blackpool, the 13th of March in Northern Ireland. You will need to take a plane or a boat to get there. It's over the water. No regionals on the weekend of the 19th and 20th. And then 4 in a row, we got Bournemouth on the 27th of March, Norwich on the 2nd of April, Glasgow on the 10th of April, and St Austell in Cornwall on the 17th of April. And I will definitely be going to Norwich and St Austell. Verdict is out, and I won't be going Glasgow. Verdict is out on Bournemouth, Northern Ireland and Blackpool. So there we go. Some tournaments which, especially those of you in the UK, should be excited about. If there are any international listeners wondering about going to the ECC, it could well, from the US, it's a heck of a long way to go, but Pablo Meza, lovely Mexican chap, turned up a few years ago and made it into the top cut. Lovely to see him there. So if there are any Americans, Canadians, etc. that can make it over, why not, quite frankly? And just before we got on some new cards, I have started to upload an expanded tournament on YouTube. Can be found at youtube.com/PTCG Radio. We have a vanity URL. It's awesome. And round 1 featuring Night March against Fighting Bats from 2 excellent players is already online. And there'll be another one going up today or tomorrow. So new videos going up as promised. So moving on to some new cards then. First of all, we have a Pinsir, and it's not terribly good. Relevant because we don't see all that many Pinsirs in the game. 100 HP. For 1 grass energy, it does 30 damage. And 20 to one of your benched. 30 for 1 grass on a basic is okay. Doing 20 to your bench at the same time, not amazing. Some Pokemon, think the old Outrage Pokemon, the Kyurem, Reshiram, Zekrom, expanded obviously, that do more, and they're not the only examples. Some Pokemon do more damage based on the amount of damage done to them. Maybe it will work. And there's a Vanillite, which for 1 water stops damage by 20 the following turn. I'm going to be honest, nobody really cares about a basic Vanillite. So let's move on. We have some new supporters, and these are kind of cool. And for some reason, they seem to be based around some of the original region's gym leaders. So we've got Giovanni's Plans. This allows you to choose one of the following 2 things. So kind of like those stadia I told you about that do different things depending on which side of the table you're on. Giovanni's Plans, you get a choice. You can either draw cards until you have 5 in your hand, or until the end of your turn, each Pokemon's attacks do 20 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon. This is kind of cool. I like this, because it might be early game. The reasons we don't like cards, like this in the past that do extra damage is, quite frankly, because sometimes you need to just draw cards with your supporters, and it's not always good enough. Sometimes you need cards and you don't really want to do anything else. Like Iris did a very similar thing, where more on her later. Whereas here, you can either draw cards, and if you don't need cards, you can do extra damage. That's really kind of cool. I like that. And there's also Bridget. Search your deck for 1 basic Pokemon EX, or up to 3 basic Pokemon, excluding EX, and put them onto your bench. It's Pokemon Collector, and we wanted this for a long time. Except if you're getting EXs, it's only 1. Although you could use that to get Hooper to get 3 Pokemon EXs. So that is a possibility. You can use it, although you can use Ultra Ball to get 1 Hooper. One of the reasons Pokemon Collector was so good, and it was just search for free basic Pokemon. One of the reasons Pokemon Collector was so good back in the day was because you could use it to search for cards like Uxie. Uxie was Shaman, except you drew up till 7, not till 6, and it was a non-EX. So you'd go and search for 2 Pokemon you wanted, and you would search for Uxie. And that's why Bridget is not going to be as good as Pokemon Collector was back in the day. Back in the day, everybody really wanted to get their Uxies up and running. So you kind of had to play Pokemon Collector because you could get your Pokemon and you could get your Uxies. Here, you can't use Bridget to get your Shaman, so it's not going to be as good. Though remember, you can add a push, and it's not the optimal play, because really you'd rather use something like an Ultra Ball for this. But you could use Bridget to search for 1 EX, Hooper, and then use Hooper to search for 3 EXs. So that is a possibility. We have a Beheeyem Break, and I've talked about these break Pokemon in the past, more on the Golduck thing in a little bit, and I've said that they, like the Megas, they need to be good to see play. They're too much of a pain. Like the Megas have to end your turn, or did before Spirit Links, and were an extra evolution, they needed to be good. And most of them haven't been good enough. Although, you know, things like Rayquaza and Primal Groudon, colourless Rayquaza, have proven to be exceptions to the rule. Beheeyem Break. Now, it is a promo in a Korokoro Ichiban magazine. That's a Japanese magazine. Most magazine promos tend to be garbage, and Beheeyem Break is the same. Remember, you've got to evolve Beheeyem one step further. Choose any number of psychic energy attached to your Pokemon in play, and move them around to any of your other Pokemon in any way that you like, while doing 100 damage. That is rubbish for free psychic energy. And like I've said in the past, and one of the Mega Mewtwo's did this as well, it did more energy dependent on the amount of psychic. We don't have a good, reliable way to accelerate psychic energy at the moment. So it doesn't make it very good. It's a magazine promo, it's cool, it will be lovely for collectors, you ain't going to want to play it. There is a Fighting Meloetta. Remember, Meloetta comes in both psychic and fighting flavours. For 1 colourless energy. Now, this is kind of interesting. It's only got 90 HP, so it's going to be going down quick. But you get to attach 2 fighting energy from your discard pile to this Pokemon. And as I've said of a lot of attacks, one of the Charizard EX has a similar kind of attack. You don't want to attach energy as your attack, because then you're stranded in the active to be killed and essentially undo the energy attachments. But you also get to switch with one of your benched Pokemon, and that's kind of cool. For a fighting double colourless, 60 damage, 110 if they've got any psychic attached. So essentially you attach a psychic from your hand, use the first attack to attach 2 fighting and switch to the bench, and then on turn 2 you're doing 110 damage for free energy on a 90 HP Pokemon. I'm sorry if this sounds controversial. I'm not just saying this to get a rise out of you lovely people. It's not good. Smeargle. Now, I've had a bit of a thing lately. I've mentioned this seemingly very often. Pokemon that always have interesting cards. Pokemon where every time it's printed in the card game, it's interesting. Like Gengar, like Pyroar, like Vanillux. Well, Smeargle fits this, and we've got a new Smeargle, which is kind of interesting. Once during your turn, you may switch 1 basic energy card attached to your active Pokemon with 1 different type of basic energy card in your discard pile. And it's a basic Pokemon. Now, it's a want-to-turn kind of thing, but it's a basic Pokemon. And this opens up all kinds of interesting plays. A lot of decks nowadays are playing Battle Compressor. Not everyone, but a lot of them are playing Battle Compressor. So it's not going to take very much to just put 1 random different colour energy in your deck, discard it with Battle Compressor, and then use a Smeargle. So, for instance, you know, you can have, I mean, to take a not very good example, Jirachi EX in Expanded. Now, Jirachi's attack, you need 1 metal energy to do it. And it's not a great example. It's not a great attack, but it's a good example. And Jirachi is played in every deck. Well, it was when it was legal. It was in every deck. But you can never attack with it. But what you could do is play 1 metal energy, discard it with your first Battle Compressor, and then if you're in a bind and need to use Jirachi, you just use Smeargle to switch the energy over. Now, there are better combinations than that. What I mean is this opens up the door for interesting combos, which probably none of us have thought of yet. But what I really like about this is it opens up the possibility. It opens up the chances of somebody coming up with a really, really good idea. And, yeah, maybe it's not going to turn out to be very good. But I really like the idea of being able to play some random energy just so you can, essentially roll out these combos as if from nowhere. You can just play one of a random energy and just use it to have a bit of a play. And yeah, maybe it's going to turn out to be rubbish, who knows. But I kind of like the idea. I really, really do. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. I have a lot of faith that sooner... And this might be one of those cards that we forget about for ages. Fair enough. But I'm hoping it's a card that sooner or later somebody is going to realise a really cool thing they can do with it. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the news. Oh, other than to say, Chestnut and Raichu break have been confirmed in English, so we know... Oh, and some new details were released in the press release. So, new break evolution game mechanic. When a Pokemon evolves into a break, it gets an HP boost and a new attack or ability, but keeps its existing attacks. They have a landscape design, unique foil pattern, and uniquely rendered art. Still doesn't tell us if... It seems at the moment, like Pokemon Break, there is no extra, you just have to evolve them again. There's no shortcut. There's no Spirit Link equivalent, shall we say. 6 new Pokemon Break, including Chestnut and Zoroark, and now we've had Raichu revealed, so now we know 3 of them, and we know we're not getting all of them, we're only getting 6. We're not getting all the ones that have been revealed in Japan, but we know we are going to be getting Chestnut and Raichu. 20 trainer cards, including 2 full art rare Ultra Trainer cards. That could be the Giovanni and Bridget I've just told you about. You never know. 2 new theme decks. Yay. Sorry, I'm not excited by theme decks anymore. So, that is the news. Let's get to some corrections. Couple of things from the last couple of weeks. Now, and you want to sit down for this. If you're on a treadmill, slow it down. If you're on a bike, pull over. If you're driving, make sure you're not going to get into an accident when I reveal this shocking fact. You ready? Sometimes I'm going to make mistakes. I know. We are 163 episodes into a weekly podcast. Not to mention the coming on for 200 videos I've put up on YouTube. Sometimes I am going to make little mistakes. Now, bearing in mind, I don't generally make mistakes about things that have been out for a while. The mistakes I'm making are cards which have just been revealed. Sometimes I've missed something and I've made a mistake. Sometimes I've been working off a bad translation. Sometimes we don't have the answers. So a little couple of corrections here, but just to be clear, and most of you are awesome, just so we're clear. But, and YouTube's worse than this. For some reason, I seem to like my podcast listeners more than YouTube. But don't tell them. Because, I don't know, you guys are special. Maybe it's because it takes more effort to download the podcast. Maybe it's just because the podcast was here before the YouTube channel. Or maybe I'm just being a bit silly. But either way, I love you guys. Point is this. Couple of corrections to make. Mistakes happen. Boo-hoo. Evil Tao. Now, the Evil Tao from last week, I told you about his ability, which stops all tools having an effect. And I said it would turn off Garbodor, which is a ridiculous thing to say, which I realised fairly shortly afterwards. But a huge thank you to Lord Jushihiro, sorry for the pronunciation, and Jorby Froki, at Jared the Unseen, both of whom on Twitter corrected me, as they well should have done, though I had already realised my silly mistake. The Evil Tao stops the effects of tools. It doesn't get rid of the tools. And of course, let's say for argument's sake Garbodor has a floatstone attached. It means a floatstone won't give him free retreat. But he will still have a floatstone attached, which means he'll still have a tool attached, which means he will block abilities. So I don't need to worry, which will then ironically turn off Evil Tao's ability, meaning that the floatstone does have an effect. So my apologies about that. Heavy boots, I was talking about Mamoswine on a previous podcast for way too long, and I said heavy boots increase the retreat cost. That was a translation doing the rounds. That is not the correct translation. The translation is, it can only be attached to a Pokemon that has a retreat cost of 3 or more, which means you are going to be using a combination of Team Aqua's Hideout and Piloswine and all of that to try and increase. I still think there's a deck there with Mamoswine, or Piloswine more likely, I suppose. But the big thing is going to be trying to keep the free energy onto Piloswine. I'm not sure how we're going to do it. The only option I've got at the moment is to use Maxis to restore a Mega Lucario and then use a combination of Mega Turbo and Energy Switch to get the energy onto Piloswine. Which, aside from the fact you need your Maxis to get out your Mamoswines, it's a ridiculous idea. It's way too involved. But, you know, Piloswines are stage 1, and we've got Wally, and we've got Maxis, and we've got Rare Candy. I don't think it's unreasonable to get, you know, a couple of Piloswines and a Mamoswine or 2 out by turn 2 or 3, and then be hitting for a lot of energy, a lot of damage every turn. The question is going to be, can we get the energy on Piloswine? He's fighting and a double colourless. And this one isn't really a correction. This is back to the Golduck Break. I was talking last week about Golduck Break and the fact that it's an awesome card, but not as a stage 2, which it essentially is, except it's a rubbish stage 2, so you can't even Rare Candy it. You've got to either Archie's for a Golduck and evolve, Wally for a Golduck and evolve, or evolve to Golduck turn 2 and Golduck Break turn 3. Golduck, essentially, it's Aromatisse for all basic energy. You can move them around as much as you like. It's a wonderful ability, but on a Pokemon that's hard to use. So I mooted the idea last week of using Archie's Ace in the Hole to restore the Golduck Break to the bench as a basic Pokemon, which you could do as early as turn 1, which would be an amazing card. Unfortunately, it's not going to work. Now, a couple of people, I believe it was Michael Martin and my good friend Becca Manda, both of those people pointed me to an old ruling from Garchomp Level X. Not Garchomp C Level X, the one that everybody used in the Plasma decks, but the Garchomp Level X, which there was a rogue deck with that one year, I remember sitting here following US Nationals one year, and people were like, oh my god, Garchomp Level X is doing well. Garchomp Level X is doing, and everyone sat there for cheering for Garchomp until it inevitably failed, because it wasn't that great a deck, but it did quite well. So there was a Garchomp Level X. It came out in Majestic Dawn, and it had an attack for no energy. Search your discard pile for a Pokemon, excluding Level X, and put it onto your bench as a basic Pokemon. Then you may search your discard pile and attach up to 3 basic energy to that Pokemon. Fair enough. And then, while that was still legal, we had Pokemon Legends. Now, if you haven't been playing for too long, you might not remember Legends. Legends were cool. Look them up. They're brilliant for collecting. But you had Ho-Oh Legend and Lugia Legend in Heart Gold Soul Silver, I want to say. And then they released more Legend cards that were pairs. There was Entei Suicune Legend and Palkia Dialga Legend. And they were fun little cards where you had to get both halves in your hand, and then you could only play them if you had both halves in your hand at once. And the ruling was about Garchomp Level X and Legends, and it basically said you cannot restore half of a legend, because you cannot restore the whole legend, it's 2 cards. You cannot restore half of a legend because on its own it isn't a real card, and that creates an impossible game state. That is not quite the same thing as we've got with Archie's and Golduck, but it is the best analogy we've got. I've had people go both ways on this. I've had a lot of people get in touch with me on Facebook and Twitter. I thank all of those lovely people. I also reached out to a bunch of UK judges who judge at Worlds, who are incredibly knowledgeable and whose opinions I respect greatly. And the answer from all of the judges came back the same, and it was what I was starting to fear. Golduck Break isn't a real card. It doesn't have a retreat cost. I might have tweeted this out. I think I did at one point. It's not a real card. It doesn't have a retreat cost. It doesn't have a weakness. It doesn't have a resistance. To put it another way, these break cards do not have all the information on them that you would expect a Pokemon card to have. They are exactly like the top half of a card. You've got your HP, you've got an ability or an attack. Seems to be one or the other. And actually, looking at the promotional information, it says, and a new attack or ability. So it seems like they are limiting it. Either they've written that clumsily, or it will always be one ability or one attack. But they don't have a retreat cost, they don't have weakness, they don't have resistance. At this stage, I think it would be a very big surprise if Archie's Ace in the Hole did work with Golduck Break. And this makes me sad, but hey ho, what can you do? It is very, very sad. So, that is my corrections for this week, and I'm sorry if I upset any of you. So as well as all this going on Twitter this week, I've had some very interesting questions, so I thought I would get to a couple of them. Now, most of the stuff that goes on YouTube, I'm not going for. People tend to be negative on YouTube. I'll record like an hour-long video that's viewed 500 to 1,000 times, and it'll get 20 likes, and then the one comment will be some dude going, well, actually, sometimes when you were referring to Shaman EX's ability, you were saying, attack, you were saying setup when you meant Sky Return. You know what? I probably was. But when Shaman's attacking and using his ability multiple times per game, I might get the name confused here and there. But if you've noticed I'm doing it, then clearly you know, and I'm commentating well enough that you can follow the game. Not a big fan of negativity on YouTube lately, although just so we're clear, it's not going to stop me posting videos or even slow them down, so don't worry, I've got your backs, people. Just also, I wanted to clarify my comments about commentating Worlds. I've said this many, many times, let me make it clear. I'm not saying I should commentate at Worlds. I would love to commentate at Worlds. What I'm saying is that every part of Worlds has an international flavour other than the commentary. The translators, the judges, the helpers, the participants, the spectators, the vendors, etc. all have an international flavour. And all of the commentators are from the USA. And many of them, not all of them, do a pretty good job. But we need some variety, ladies and gentlemen. We really, really do. I've asked you all to send support tickets to Pokemon.com suggesting this. And I would recommend you do so again. File a support ticket, tell them they need an international commentator. What I've always said is if you want to put my name forward in that support ticket, I would of course encourage you to do so. And I would love to commentate at Worlds. But my argument has always been, let's have an international commentator. So some of the questions. Scott Howard, I love his Twitter handle, @garbled_leopard, which is awesome. He asks, and this is a very pertinent question at this stage, has the price of Shaman EX peaked? Now, I'm sure some of you guys have noticed that Shaman EX as a card, now I've seen plenty of people on Facebook selling for 20 English pounds and all of that. That's about the going price on Facebook. But if you go on eBay or Amazon or any card website, they're going to try and get a lot more money. I've seen people put them up for $60, $80. It's a lot of money. And the question is, and it's an excellent question, I'm very glad you asked it. The question essentially is, do I just have to pony up for Shaman? Or if I wait, will it go down in price? Now, ironically, I've told you guys this before, I do teach business and law, but I teach business, one of the things I do for a living. And in this week, we've actually been learning about supply and demand. And I've even put a picture of Shaman EX in their handout and used it as an example in lessons, because their teacher is cool. And essentially, it is a basic supply and demand problem. When Shaman first came out, it came out in Roaring Skies. And the price of Roaring Skies, when Roaring Skies was the most recent set, no card is ever going to get stupid expensive, which is why, and this is a tip for the future, if you're worried about a card like Shaman going really expensive, buy it before the next set comes out. Because while Roaring Skies is legal, while it's the new set, every shop you go into, you get Roaring Skies. Every tournament you go to, unless it's a really rubbish tournament, the prize packs are Roaring Skies. Everyone's getting Roaring Skies, which means a steady stream of Shamans are being pulled, and a steady stream of Shamans are being sold by people who pulled them and no longer want them. But then Ancient Origins comes out, and that is what you get in all the shops. And the shops tend to sell out of Roaring Skies, and then they won't want to restock because, well, Roaring Skies is the last set, we want to stock Ancient Origins. I know some shops still do, but the point is they want the most recent set. That is where their shelf space is going to be headed. Not only that, but you go to tournaments and the prize packs are not Roaring Skies, they're now Ancient Origins. And this means that less Roaring Skies is being sold, and of course, as soon as a new set comes out, the production run for Roaring Skies gets cut back and then ended. Because, well, Pokemon have sold Roaring Skies, they've essentially got a 3-month window per set, and they use that to make their money. And then they've got a 3-month window to make their money off Ancient Origins, so that's what they're really pushing forward. That's what they want in the shops, that's where the advertisements are going to be. So, Roaring Skies will become scarcer and scarcer over time. From a supply point of view, there will be less Shaymins entering. And there'll still be new players coming in, players who don't have enough. So, the supply of Shaymins is dwindling because much, and this is only going to get worse as time goes by, less Roaring Skies is being produced and sold. Now, this isn't a huge problem if Shaymin is a bit of a one-hit wonder. I.e., if Shaymin isn't that good, think something along the lines of Black Kyurem EX, for instance. He's really, really good, but he's only good in one deck, and then sooner or later that deck goes away, which it did when Tropical Beach got rotated. Now that deck has gone away, and we don't need to worry about it anymore, so we're good. Now that price is going to stabilise. And in the back of people, there's always people sitting there going, well, I'm not playing Blastoise, I'm not paying that for a Black Kyurem EX. Or people going, yeah, but Tropical Beach is going to be rotated, so I can't push the price up too much, no one will want to buy it. The problem is, that is not happening with Shaymin. There are two things in Shaymin's favour. First of all, it needs to be played in basically every deck, and in multiples, 2 or 3 in most decks. Although I know some competitive players who swear by the fact you need 4 in every deck, and I'm not inclined to argue with them very much. So, it doesn't look to be going away anytime soon. The only thing that would really kill the demand for Shaymin is a better alternative. But even then, what are they going to possibly print that's better than Shaymin? Or a hard counter that stops people playing Shaymin. And we got 2 of them in Silent Lab and Wobbuffet, and no one's playing them, ladies and gentlemen. That's a complete lie. Nobody's playing them in big enough numbers to substantially affect the demand of Shaymin. Yeah, people are playing Wobbuffet in Groudon, but that doesn't mean that people are going, well, I'm not buying Shaymin for $60 because some people are playing Groudon and they play Wobbuffet in it. So the answer, in the long-winded way, is probably not. And if you need Shaymins, I would recommend going to get them. Think back to when Pokemon Catcher was like $20 for an uncommon. Because you needed 4 Pokemon Catcher in every deck. And Emerging Powers was 2 years old. So you had 2 choices. You can pay $20 for a Pokemon Catcher, or you can not have Pokemon Catcher. And Shaymin's going to be like that, but worse. If you need Shaymins, you need to go out. And I'm afraid if you're playing Pokemon nowadays, you need Shaymins. You need to go out and get them sooner rather than later. The one big question mark was going to be whether it was released as a tin promo. And I did recommend to you guys over the podcast to wait and see if it was coming out in a tin. Hooper EX is really good. That's got an awesome ability. It allows you to free Pokemon EXs. It's awesome. But it was going to be a tin promo. And the price never gets too high if it's going to be a tin promo. And when it's released as a tin promo, the price of the regular and the tin promo shoot right down. We've seen our tin promos, ladies and gentlemen. They ain't Shaymin. Maybe one day it will be, but it ain't going to be now. And the X's in the UK and the US and Europe and all of that, they're only released as tin promos. They're the only promos we get. So, the only promo EXs anyway. And yes, I know Tornadus was a pre-release promo, but that was because it was the box promo in Japan that you got for buying a box of the set. Shaymin EX wasn't, so we ain't getting it as a pre-release promo. So, unfortunately, no, I don't think Shaymin EX is getting any cheaper. So you need to just buy them. And I know it sucks. What can you do? The other really interesting question I got this week came from Mason Berry at Rick95051 on Twitter. Can you break down how important Shaymin versus Mewtwo versus Seismitoad in their metas at the time? Which was more of a staple? Really interesting question. One that I was going to reply on, and it came a couple of weeks ago, so sorry, Mason. But I wanted to save it for the podcast. Of course, I probably could have tweeted I'll answer it on the podcast, so sorry, that one's on me. But here's your answer anyway. Seismitoad had a very brief window. When Lissandra's trump card wasn't banned, it was ridiculous. And we saw this at UK Nationals. It got to the point where it was basically the only viable deck. And from the question, I'm assuming you weren't, and I'm sorry if this is untrue, I'm assuming you weren't playing when Gardevoir Gallade was big. Don't feel bad, neither was I. It was kind of like that. We got to the point where you could only really play Seismitoad, and if you didn't, there was a decent chance. Although, to be honest, even Gardevoir Gallade, I'm not sure ever got to that point, because there were counters for that. They just lost to essentially everything but Gardevoir Gallade, from what I understand. Outside of that, Seismitoad has always been big. And it's had times of complete dominance. But it's never really taken over Worlds like that. Didn't win Worlds this year. Didn't win Worlds last year. There's always been decks out there like Virizion and Genesect, which have been played in large enough numbers that they're not just odd counter decks, they are big metagame decks that beat it. Seismitoad has always been good. But I'm putting it as number 3 on this list. I know, potentially controversial, but they're all super important. But I'm putting Seismitoad as number 3 because there was only one point where it was completely and utterly killing the game. It was always good, and it's been winning tournaments for years, and will continue to do so. But it was never the only viable deck, except for that brief window with Lissandra's trump card, when we realised we could run through our entire deck, play a whole bunch of hammers, super scoop up and lasers, trump card, and then go around the whole thing again. They banned it so quickly that had they not banned it, the answer... Although actually Shaman was only used... Seismitoad was only really good when Shaman came out in Roaring Skies. So yeah, even then it was really Roaring Skies until the banning where it was really good. So yeah, comes in third, but it really did. For that brief time, it completely overtook the meta. And even outside of that, it's always been good. Coming in at number 2, we have Mewtwo. Now, for more recent listeners, you might not quite get the Mewtwo thing because, well, it's been legal for a while and it's been an occasional one-off. When Mewtwo came out, it was ridiculous. It literally got to the point where you either had to play Mewtwo or you lost. And you had to play 2 or 3 Mewtwo because game after game after game came down to the Mewtwo war. It wasn't just that Mewtwo was awesome, it was that the best Mewtwo counter was Mewtwo. And it got to this ridiculous point where tournament after tournament was just Mewtwo against Mewtwo. Now, as new cards came out, it became less good. And it did start to dwindle a little bit. And it kind of... It fell off a little bit. And this is my argument against Lugia. Lugia will never be as good as Seismitoad. We're in a different metagame. But for a while, it was, especially when it came out and we didn't have many EXs. I mean, I spoke about the ECC earlier. The first year I went was in 2012. And I went to the ECC in 2012 with 3 Mewtwo's in my deck. And I won 6 out of 8 games, finishing 33rd and bubbling, which was sad. I reckon I won at least 3 of those games just because I had more Mewtwo's than my opponent. I remember one game when my opponent was playing ZPST. It was basically a game... Pachirisu, you could put him down with 2 extra energy. Shaman allowed you to move energy around the field, and Zekrom hit 120 for free energy. So what you would do is you would essentially play Pachirisu with 2 energy, use Shaman to move it onto Zekrom, and you'd be hitting 120 damage on turn 1. So I played his opponent, and I just kill his Zekrom with my Mewtwo. And he looks really pleased. He drops a Mewtwo, Pachirisu, Shaman. He kills my Mewtwo with his Mewtwo. So I just dropped a second Mewtwo, and his face fell. Because he clearly was only playing a single Mewtwo in his deck. And then I ran through the rest of his deck with Mewtwo. Yes, it really dropped off towards the end, but there were a couple of years where Mewtwo Wars were the format. And literally, you would have to have a really good reason for not playing free Mewtwo in your deck. You needed free Mewtwo in your deck, no matter what you were playing, because so many decks came down to to Mewtwo Wars. Now, I know we're brief in, but I'm still willing to put Shaymin as the number one here, and the reason is very, very simple. You need at least 2 copies in almost every single deck. You can get away without it in something like Groudon, where you sit behind a Wobbuffet and set up. Almost every other deck needs 2 Shaymin. But here's the deal. Both Mewtwo and Seismitoad, you can counter them by playing a deck that counters it. Or the deck can lose pieces in rotation, and then no one will want to play them anymore. Shaymin is a staple that you need to set up every deck. So it doesn't really matter what rotation happens, what new cards come out, unless we get something which, counters Shaymin better than Silent Lab and Wobbuffet, which is quite hard to imagine, or we get to a stage where we've got something even better than Shaymin. It will remain a minimum of a 2 in 90% of competitive decks until it's rotated. And that is an impact that neither Mewtwo nor Mewtwo nor Seismitoad could ever actually match. Now, this is a fun little question. Rank these 3 Pokemon, Shaymin, Mewtwo, Seismitoad, in terms of how important they were in their meta at the time. So hit me up on Twitter at @TheWassy or on email at ptcgradio@hotmail.co.uk to let me know your opinion on this, or if you think there were other cards that were even more important in their respective days. So, let's jump forward. We're 40 minutes in, so let's be quick about this. Supporters. Let's go through set by set. We'll look at every supporter in every set, and then we'll figure out at the end what we need to know for Expanded. In black and white, we were given Juniper. It's been reprinted as Professor Sycamore. Don't worry about it. In Emerging Powers, we got Cherin, that's been reprinted as Tierno, and we got Bianca. Draw until you've got 6 cards in your hand. It's basically Shaymin as a supporter. Now, there are reasons to play Bianca, because a lot of decks, by virtue of playing Shaymin now, they will play to empty their hand, Shaymin for 6, empty their hand, Shaymin for 6. If you're playing a style of deck where you're emptying your hand and drawing a bunch, well, that makes Bianca pretty good, because Bianca does the same thing as Shaymin without putting a weak 2 pricey X on your bench. So, don't sleep on Bianca, she could be useful. In Noble Victories, we were given N, and let me be really clear about this, there are 3 really good supporters we get back in Expanded. N is top of the list. It's a good draw. It's, for those that don't remember, each player shuffles a hand into their deck and draws cards equal to the number of prize cards remaining. If my opponent's got 1 prize card left and I haven't taken one yet, I get 6 cards, they get 1. It's good for early game consistency. It's late for trying to make a comeback at the end by stifling your opponent's hand of all useful resources. It's amazing. And especially, you saw, for instance, in Jacob Van Wagner's Worlds winning list, he played a single N because he played Battle Compressor and VS Seeker. You can do that nowadays. Any deck playing 4 VS Seeker in Expanded without a really good reason to the contrary, which there might be, you need at least 1 copy of N. Now, another interesting card in Noble Victories was X-Transceiver. It's a trainer, an item. Flip a coin. If head, search your deck for a supporter and put it in your hand. This is good for a turn 1 Wally or a turn 1 Getsis or something like that. Never saw a huge amount of play, but I'd be interested in this kind of, we can draw cards really quick in the format at the moment. And that does give rise to something like X-Transceiver. Of course, most of the time I'd rather just play a Trainer's Mail, to be fair. In Next Destinies, we had Silent. That was the only supporter. Imagine how fun those pre-releases were. They weren't. It was like Professor's Letter, but it got you 3 basic energy, not 2. There is no, unless you're playing a Vileplume deck, in which case you're not likely to want a load of energy. There aren't many good reasons for playing Silent, because you can just play Professor's Letter, unless you are truly terrified of Trainer Lock. But then if you're Trainer Locked, what are the chances of drawing into your 1 or 2 Silence anyway? Now, Dark Explorers gave us reprints of Cherin and Professor Juniper. But it also gave us Hooligans, Jim and Kaz, which did see a little bit of play here and there, mostly in kind of league decks. It didn't make many competitive decks, not like that. Flip a coin. If heads, choose 3 cards at random from your opponent's hand and shuffle them into their deck. And this was used in some rogue control decks. But imagine you're playing something like Executor with Vileplume. You are trainer locking them. You are supporter locking, or item locking them. You are supporter locking them. And then you've got 4 chances to shuffle 3 cards from their hand back into their deck. So they can't play trainers, they can't play supporters, and you might even grab a couple of their energy or something and get rid of them as well. Something to think about. They also had Random Receiver. Now, I played Random Receiver. Random Receiver became really good in, like I said, that small period of time when we had Lysandra's trump card. I've told you on the podcast before about my Donphan list. And what my Donphan list would do is it would essentially play 4 Juniper, 4 Random Receiver, 4 VS Seeker. So every turn I'm playing a Professor Juniper. It was awesome. Nowadays, you want to be playing a couple of Lysandra as well, and there's other supporters you might want to play, and you've got Shaman, and you can't recycle so much. So, Random Receiver, I think, had a very brief resurgence. I'm not a huge fan of it. Dragons Exalted, to the best of my knowledge, had no supporters. Just gonna let that sink in for a second. No supporters. Step up your game, Dragons Exalted. Boundaries Crossed saw Skylar. Skylar is the second of the 3 really good supporters we get back in Expanded. Skylar allows you to search for any trainer card. Worst case scenario, use it to search for something like a Juniper. But there's simple things like when I play Vileplume decks, you need Forest of Giant Plants to get that turn 1 Vileplume. And in Expanded, you've got Skylar. And Skylar allows you to search for a stadium. And it's awesome. You could Skylar for a computer search for a special energy like Double Colourless. I miss Skylar. You know, you could... I don't know, it was just really, really good. I really liked it. Again, not a 4-off, maybe a 1-off in decks with VS Seeker. And I'm going to talk in a minute, but in Expanded, playing 1-offs of particular supporters really is not a bad idea. We also had Hue. Both players draw or discard cards until they have 5 in their hand. Too inconsistent to really see a lot of use. Again, in a control deck, maybe a 1-off to use with VS Seeker. It's awesome, you know, you have the odd turn where you get to draw 4 cards and your opponent has to discard 4. And in a Vileplume deck, it's kind of fun because it forces them to discard cards. Although a lot of the time they'll just be item cards they didn't really want anyway. I don't know. It's out there. It's vaguely interesting. And in Plasma Storm, we get the third of the good supporters we get back. Chorus. Shuffle your hand into your deck and draw cards equal to the number of bench Pokemon each player has in play. With Skyridge, Skyridge. I'm forgetting the name of that stadium. Bear with me, we'll get back to it. Is it Skyridge? Sounds like I'm saying that wrong. We'll get there. You can have 16 bench Pokemon in play. That, ladies and gentlemen, means you can draw 16 cards. If you don't hit what you want off 16 cards, you ain't winning the game. So, it's a fun little card. It's, you know, it wasn't really a 4-of. Skyfield, that's the one. It's not really a 4-of in any deck, but as a 1-of for VS Seeker or a 2-of, it was terrible on turn 1. But generally, after a couple of turns, it was better than Juniper a lot of the time. We also had Team Plasma Grunt. Discard a Plasma card and draw 3 cards. It's terrible. Even in a Plasma deck, it's not worth playing. And in Expanded, people aren't playing Plasma. Sorry. We also, in Plasma Freeze, had Shadow Triad. Now, Shadow Triad was moderately useful for reusing lasers, and if you're playing Virizion Genesect, you need it to reuse G-Booster. Now, this is kind of useful for maybe Seismitoad decks in Expanded, because, well, we don't, you can use Dowsing Machine, essentially Junk Arm, to get 1 laser back, but then you can use Shadow Triad with VS Seeker to get loads of lasers back. If you're playing something like a Seismitoad list, playing 1 Shadow Triad potentially gives you access to 5 more lasers. 1 from the Shadow Triad, 4 from the VS Seeker, assuming you use them all for lasers. So don't sleep on Shadow Triad as a way to reuse lasers in Expanded. We also saw Get Sis. I love Get Sis. Your opponent shuffles all their item cards from their hand into their deck, and you draw as many cards as they've got. If you're playing a Vileplume deck in Expanded, chuck one of these in for funsies. You can sometimes draw an awful lot of cards. Or even the Trevenant deck, which also blocks trainers, or even a Seismitoad deck, to be honest. As a one-off, it's pretty cool. And then we get to the real dregs of the list. Plasma Blast had Caitlyn, which everyone said was going to work for Stage 2 decks, but never really did. You get to put as many cards as you like on the bottom of your deck and then draw that many cards. So let's say you had a rare candy in your hand, you could put the other 5 cards at the bottom, draw 5 more to search for the Stage 2, rather than playing an N where you'd have to then draw the candy and the Stage 2. It's underwhelming. The thing it doesn't do is it doesn't really give you a card advantage. You're not drawing new cards, you're just replacing cards. So you never really... if you play 4 cards from your hand, then you say you've got a hand of 6. You play 4, well now you can only use Caitlyn to reuse 2. Whereas with N, you can play 4 cards and then N yourself into 6. You don't get a card advantage from Caitlyn. And that's why it never really saw much play. We also had Iris, 10 more damage for every prize card that your opponent has taken. I think it's not terrible by any stretch of the imagination. But it's just not good. And again, and I know I keep saying this, it's useful potentially as a one-off to reuse with VS Seeker. And I know I say that a lot, but essentially all of these niche supporters, the best use for them is put as a one-off and try and use it with VS Seeker. It's not a great supporter. And it shouldn't surprise you here that the supporters that didn't see play first time round ain't going to see much play in Expanded. We also had another reprint of Juniper. And finally, in Legendary Treasures, we had a Bianca reprint. Yay. We had an Elisa, which allowed you to search for Pokemon tools, and nobody ever played it because that's not a good enough use for your supporter. And the really, really weird Cedric Juniper. Now, Cedric Juniper was a really odd card because it was kind of like you gave your opponent a quiz. Let me read the text to you. Put a Pokemon from your hand face down in front of you and tell your opponent its name. Your opponent guesses the height of that Pokemon. Reveal that Pokemon. If your opponent guessed right, he draws 3 cards. If your opponent guessed wrong, you draw 3 cards. Okay. But if you want to draw 3 cards, you can just use Cherin or Tierno nowadays. And you would never want... And I suppose you could maybe get your opponent to draw 3 cards... so they decked out. But your opponent, even if they knew the answer, would pretend they didn't if they didn't want to draw 3 cards. It's a weird kind of card. I love how weird it is, but it's not good enough to actually see any play. And if it was winner draws like 8 cards, you would literally have people learning the height of every meta-relevant Pokemon. A list would be produced on the internet of every meta-relevant Pokemon. So you'd say Blastoise. Everyone would know the height of a Blastoise because it was worth too much. So then nobody would play Cedric Juniper. As a quick side note for Cedric Juniper, the annoying thing about this card, before Cedric Juniper, I always just wrote Juniper on my deck list. I know it's actually Professor Juniper. But, there was only one Juniper. At 2014, I actually got a warning. I made top 32 and I turned up in the morning and they took me to one side and said there was a problem with my deck list. And I'm thinking, oh my god, what am I going to have to remove and replace with basic energy? Am I getting disqualified? And they said, you wrote Juniper, you should have said Professor Juniper. We're giving you a warning. I got like 9 warnings that tournament. Do you know what happens if you get 9 unrelated warnings? Absolutely nothing. You can get as many as you like. I got like... I don't think I might have made double digits. So I got at least 9 warnings that tournament. And nothing happened because they're just warnings. But now you have to write Professor Juniper on your deck list. Because if you just write Juniper, it could be Professor or Cedric. So, let's have a quick summary before I leave you lovely people alone for another week. I say leave you alone. There's a new video going up tonight or tomorrow. There are 3 really good cards that we're getting back. N, Skylar, and Colrus. They are brilliant supporters, and and people do this in Expanded. They fall into the habit of just using Expanded decks with a couple new cards. They get themselves thinking about Expanded, and they forget about cards like N, like Skylar. I've seen people even forget ace specs in Expanded lists. N, Skylar, and Colrus are the big ones. Bianca's on the periphery. It's not quite good enough, but it's awesome play in Darkrai, and it could see play again. You also need to be aware of Hugh, Hooligans Gym and Gas, Getsis, and Shadow Triad, because all of them could be useful. Everything else on the list, I think it's garbage. Sorry. Random Receiver and X-Transceiver, keep them in mind. I am not endorsing either of them. But here's the thing about Expanded. There are two cards which make playing one-off supporters genuinely viable, in a way that they never were even with 4VS Seeker. Computer Search and Jirachi. Computer Search allows you to search your deck for any card, and Jirachi allows you to bench it and search for a supporter. This means you don't have to rely on getting it in the discard pile with or without a battle compressor and then using a VS Seeker to get it back, or finding your one and only copy. You've got Jirachi and you've got Computer Search, and that's why playing one-offs of supporters, it's a far more viable tactic in Expanded than it is in Standard. In Standard, you've got VS Seeker and Trainer's Mail. Well, they ain't going to cut it. Alright, and that, ladies and gentlemen, will be about... Sorry, I just hit the microphone. That will be about it for this week. I've told you about some corrections, I've told you some news, I've answered some listeners' questions, and I have gone ahead and even let you know all about the supporters in the format at the moment. Hopefully it was enlightening. Just a reminder, you can find me on Twitter at the Wassy. You can find me on email at ptcgradio@hotmail.co.uk, and you should be subscribing to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/PTCG Radio, if you haven't done so already. And of course, there's my video game channel, Wassy Plays, which is a featured channel on PTCG Radio and can be found by just searching. It's like this, but for video games, and I have a sneaking suspicion if you try it, you just might like it. Thank you very much for listening. My name's Ross. Look after yourselves till next week. You've been listening to PTCG Radio.